All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Sam Floor. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. So pleased to see such a great turnout for one of our new time lectures. Before we get to today's program, I just wanted to quickly plug a couple of upcoming events here at the VMHC. So next Tuesday, April 28th at noon, one of Brian's colleagues at VCU will be joining us, Dr. Brooke Newman, to discuss her latest book, The Crown's Silence: The Hidden History of the British Monarchy and Slavery in the Americas, a revelatory history of the British monarchy's centuries-long involvement in the transatlantic slave trade and colonial slavery. We've seen she's been speaking at some other institutions across town, and a really great presenter, so I hope you can join us for that. The following day, on Wednesday, April 29th at 6 p.m., join us for another of our Created Equal film series featuring the documentary screening and talkback of Culture Keepers, Voices of the Land, which centers the lived experiences of Virginia tribal citizens who have preserved their identity, heritage, and community across generations. And then looking into May, on Saturday, May 9th, we have the latest in our ever-popular Collections Up Close series, where VMHC staff curate displays featuring some of the museum's millions of artifacts and manuscripts that are not currently on exhibit, and lead guests on an exclusive behind-the-scenes tour of the museum's storage areas. May's presentation is You're Invited, Partying Through Virginia's History, as we explore the ways individuals collectively celebrate and commemorate moments in their lives with food, fun, and festivity. So just remember, if you have any crazy photos of you at a college kegger, they might end up on a museum program, 50 years later, being ogled at by dozens of strangers. So please donate any college kegger photos for our future party presentations. And before I introduce today's speaker, I also wanted to give a quick shout out to our friends from the Virginia Department of Historic Resources who are here with us today. Much of the inspiration for today's lecture was in recognition of our recent acquisition of the maquette of the Barbara John statue that now represents Virginia in the United States Capitol's Statutory Hall. DHR was instrumental in helping to facilitate that acquisition from artist Stephen Weitzman, ensuring this incredibly important piece of Virginia history will be preserved and shared with countless generations to come. If you have not seen the maquette, I encourage you all to pop upstairs after today's presentation to have a look for yourself. So now to today's speaker. Dr. Brian Daugherity is a professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University, where his research focuses on the implementation of the Supreme Court's 1964 Brown v. Board of Education decision in Virginia. Dr. Daugherity has published and edited many works, including With All Deliberate Speed, Implementing Brown v. Board of Education, Keep On Keeping On, the NAACP, and the Implementation of Brown v. Board of Education in Virginia, and A Little Child Shall Lead Them, a documentary account of the struggle for school desegregation in Prince Edward County, Virginia. He, along with Dr. Jody Allen, is currently co-producing a documentary film on the historic Green v. New Kent County U.S. Supreme Court decision. So from an expert standpoint, I can't think of a better person to be speaking to us on the legacy of Barbara Johns on Barbara Johns Day Eve. And on a personal note, I can safely speak for many of my colleagues here at the museum that we love working with Brian on many, many projects. He's truly a great friend and supporter of the VMHC. So we're especially pleased to be welcoming once again to the stage, Dr. Brian Daugherity.
Thank you, Sam. I appreciate it very much. I'd like to start off by thanking the Museum of History and Culture for inviting me to speak about my research, especially Sam and Graham Dozier, but all the staff here has been wonderful. And as Sam mentioned, I've been thankful for partnerships that we've been involved with over the years. So I appreciate it. I'd also like to mention at the outset that I'm a faculty member at VCU, and I'm easy to locate on our history department's website. And I say that because I'm happy to answer any questions in the future that you might have about this research or about this content. If you'd like to reach out and contact me, I'm happy to stay in touch and correspond with anybody who's interested in the work that I do. Sam's already mentioned the research that I've conducted thus far that's here on the screen. So I appreciate that as part of the introduction. And I'll go ahead and begin to cycle through the slides. Today's presentation is based primarily on the work that I'm doing currently for the National Park Service. I was hired a couple of years ago along with a friend and colleague, Pippa Holloway. I'd like to thank Pippa for everything that she's done with me as part of this project, to write a study about the Moton story, the R.R. Moton High School in Farmville, Virginia, and the school desegregation process that unfolded. Moton, of course, is integral in the Brown versus Board of Education legal case and process, and it's been a real pleasure to work with Pippa on this work, and I'm very thankful for funding from the National Park Service as well. As an overview for today, what I'm going to do initially is to kind of go through the story. So for those of you who aren't as familiar with the role that Farmville and Moton played in the school desegregation process, I'm going to kind of quickly, I will say, cycle through a whole series of slides and discuss that. And then I will turn my attention to the research that I've been conducting as part of this study and as part of other work that I'm doing that I think uncovers some new information that's relevant to the story and raises some questions about the school desegregation process. So that's kind of how we're going to move forward. I'd also like to finally thank the Moton Museum itself and its staff. They are doing a tremendous job at preserving this history and making sure that this story is told widely. And so a very important partner in much of the work that I do. Barbara Johns' story and the story of the Moton school strike and the lawsuit that resulted from that strike is becoming more and more well known. Many of you have been down to the state capitol here in Richmond to see the Virginia Civil Rights Memorial that was unveiled in 2008. Just across the street at the former Hotel Richmond, the site of the Virginia Attorney General's office, we have a building that was renamed after Barbara Johns in 2017. And then most recently, just this past December, we had the Barbara Johns statue unveiled in Washington, D.C. at the United States Capitol. I personally believe that this emphasis, this growing recognition, this respect and honoring of Barbara Johns and her role in the story that I'm about to talk about is long overdue, and I'm very thankful to see it. So this is the lawsuit that was filed as a result of the Barbara Johns-led student strike in Farmville, and this is kind of integral to this story, so if you'll bear with me. Those of you who don't know Virginia as well in terms of its geography, here's a map to show you where Farmville is located. It's about an hour and a half by car southwest of Richmond. The county seat of Prince Edward County, which kind of encompasses it in a circular, semicircular fashion in Richmond here in the center of the screen. Our story revolves around, and I'm going to step back and see, is my lavalier on as well? How about now? Yeah? Come back to the microphone. All right, I'll stay here. We go through the next slide here. Our story really revolves around what we call separate but not equal in terms of education in Virginia during the Jim Crow era. So from the founding of Virginia's public schools in the 1870s all the way through the period of Brown versus Board of Education, we had two separate school systems, segregated like most aspects of life, and those schools were inequitable. This shows you the high school for African American students in Farmville, Virginia, the R.R. Moton High School. It opens in the late 1930s. This school was overcrowded from day one. It lacked many of the facilities that the white school just across town manifested, such as a cafeteria, gymnasium, science laboratories, and so on and so forth. We could go on and on. Separate but not equal was not confined to Prince Edward County. This was witnessed all over the state, and there's a wide variety of records that document this in detail. In Prince Edward County, the adults had spent a great deal of time trying to address these inequities. And so a big part of the history of the educational activism, as I call it, Graham Dozier will remember that phrase well from an article I published many years ago. Educational activism in Prince Edward County that was undertaken by the black population was aimed at those inequities. And so we have local organizations including the Parent Teachers Association, the Council for Colored Women, and many others that regularly pressured the school board to address inequities, to provide bus transportation for African American students as they did white students, to equalize the teacher salaries, to add grades, meaning add 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade to make it a more official high school experience, and so on and so forth. That educational activism had unfolded throughout the 1930s after the Moton High School opened, all the way through the period of the student strike that I'm going to focus on. Some of that educational activism had succeeded, and we do see improvements between the opening of Moton in 1939 and the student-led strike in 1951, but suffice to say there were still a lot of noticeable disparities between the white schools and the black schools in Prince Edward County and all over the state that were reflected upon and that brought about a great deal of frustration among the student body. Most notably, Barbara John, shown here on the right. Barbara was a 16-year-old junior at Robert R. Moton High School at the time. She was known as a reserved, fairly quiet, but strong-willed individual. Some of you might be familiar with her uncle Vernon Johns, who exhibited many of those same traits, kind of a determination and a strong sense of injustice. Barbara Johns was frustrated about the inequities, and she was aware of the disparities through travel that she had taken as part of school clubs and organizations and so on and so forth. So she was cognizant of the disparities that I'm kind of addressing. Barbara Johns spoke with some of her school teachers about this. And one of the more important figures is a music teacher by the name of Inez Davenport. Inez Davenport corresponded and spoke with Barbara about the inequities and gave, we learned decades later, but in the 1990s, Ms. Davenport explained that she had given Barbara encouragement and even some advice about how to conduct a student strike and so forth. I highlight that point because Inez Davenport's father was the head of the NAACP in the county of Gloucester, Virginia. And while he was head of the county NAACP in Gloucester, he had supported legal efforts, meaning litigation, to equalize the schools in that county. Inez Davenport, in other words, is very aware of not only the inequities, but some of the things that could be done to address those through the legal system. In the fall of 1950, Barbara's frustration kind of boils over, and she begins to plan with a small group of students at her high school to organize what they referred to as the Manhattan Project. And this was, meant to be a way of addressing the inequities that they were that they were surrounded by and concerned about. The following spring, Barbara's traumatized and very, very angered by a bus crash that takes place in Farmville that kills 5 African-American students and injures about a dozen others, including one of her close friends. And there's speculation as to the cause of the bus crash, but some of the reporting at the time suggested that it may have been because the African-American bus, or the bus for African-American students, was a hand-me-down, essentially, malfunctioning vehicle. So these are the things that are manifesting in Barbara as she goes through the fall of 1950 into the spring of 1951, and the result, as most of you know, and again, if I cover something that's not clear, just feel free to ask questions afterwards, but the result is the student strike that takes place starting, well, 75 years ago tomorrow. Tomorrow being the 75th anniversary of this incident. And the student strike is covered in many different scholarly works and so on and so forth, so I won't go into a whole lot of detail about it, other than to say that they walked out under Barbara's leadership, stayed on strike for several weeks, and eventually connected with attorneys who decided to handle their lawsuit against the school board. Their goal was to obtain a new high school. And that's important because when the litigation actually begins, it is to integrate the high school. And so we do have a change in the purpose of the strike as it unfolds. Now, as I indicated, they are put into contact with the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP was among the most active civil rights organizations in the nation at the time, and in the state of Virginia, I would personally argue was the leading civil rights organization of the time. The organization was headquartered in Richmond, and that was known as the Virginia State Conference. And it had branches then, or chapters, meaning local organizations all over the state of Virginia, about 100, depending on what year you look at, in virtually every city and county across the state of Virginia. And the organization had a legal focus, meaning that it attempted to address inequities in Virginia life and society primarily through the court system. And if you look very carefully on the left-hand side, you can see that the organization shown here is combating a dragon, and that the dragon has many heads reflecting racial prejudice and discrimination at the time, and that the dragon has already successfully combated a few examples of inequities. Several of these heads are severed, including unequal teacher salaries that have been an NAACP priority in the 1930s. Discrimination in education is partially severed. And then also Jim Crow interstate travel, if you're familiar by chance with the Irene Morgan story in Saluda, Virginia, or the Irene Morgan Supreme Court decision, Morgan versus Virginia. That's what that's a reference to. So the student strikers are put into contact with the NAACP, and over the course of a series of weeks, the NAACP comes to the community, meets with the students and others, and essentially convinces the community to support a lawsuit not for a separate, segregated, but new African-American high school, but a lawsuit to challenge the legality of segregation in Virginia. This lawsuit is then bundled with 4 other lawsuits similarly, arguing similarly, and works its way through the federal court system all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court hands down its decision in Brown versus Board of Education in May of 1954. As I mentioned, the NAACP's headquarters was in Richmond, and Oliver Hill, shown here in the center, was the head of that, of its legal team, which was also based in Richmond. Dr. James Tinsley, a famous dentist, was the state president for many, many years and head of the Richmond branch. And then these attorneys worked for the NAACP and were based in communities all over the state. Hill and his colleague Spotswood Robinson, not shown in this photograph, were the ones that handled the Davis case primarily. And as it worked its way up through the federal court system, they partnered with attorneys that were helping the NAACP with the other 4 cases as well, shown here. I always highlight that Hill and Thurgood Marshall, who was the head of the national NAACP's legal team in New York City, had a particularly close relationship and were lifelong friends. Marshall graduated first in his class from Howard University Law School in Washington, D.C. in 1933, and Hill was second in that class. They were, jovial competitors and lifelong co-litigators and friends and so on and so forth. Spotswood Robinson is shown here to Marshall's right, and again, to me, and I think the evidence is quite clear, it reflects a very special relationship between the Virginia NAACP and the national NAACP, which, as I mentioned, was based in New York City. Now, Brown versus Board of Education was resisted by most white Virginians. Public opinion polls from the time reflected a commitment to racial segregation in education as in other aspects of life. And this reality was reflected in the political response and many, many other types of responses to Brown versus Board of Education. Collectively, this resistance to the implementation of Brown versus Board of Education is known as massive resistance. Massive resistance entailed an alteration of the Virginia State Constitution, the adoption of dozens of different laws by the General Assembly in opposition to integration, and attacks on the NAACP and its members and its attorneys, and many, many other kind of, if you will, avenues of resistance that unfolded in Virginia pretty soon after Brown versus Board of Education. It resulted in the rise of new segregationist organizations. These are white segregationist organizations such as the Defenders of State Sovereignty. Its newspapers held, here on the left, held at the Library of Virginia, and the name itself coming from this Confederate statue. This says Defenders of State Sovereignty, hard to read, I see, but this is where the name itself comes. It's a statue there in Farmville. Newspaper editors, almost uniformly across the state, that wrote for white audiences, so I should say white newspaper editors, rejected Brown versus Board of Education and campaigned against its implementation in Virginia. I highlight James Jackson Kilpatrick because I'll come back to him in a few minutes. And then it's important to recognize that the state's political leadership was opposed to Brown versus Board of Education as well. Former governor from the 1920s, Harry Byrd, enters the United States Senate on behalf of Virginia in 1933 and serves for over 30 years in the Senate. He continued to dominate Virginia's political machine all during that time period and was an extraordinarily powerful figure. Byrd was the one that coined the phrase massive resistance and who wanted to position Virginia to kind of lead the charge against Brown versus Board of Education, similarly to the way that Virginia had led during the Civil War. The result of massive resistance, kind of broadly defined, is that Virginia positioned itself like the Deep South when it came to school integration. Virginia was able to prevent the school desegregation process for 5 years. And during that time period, as I mentioned, the massive resistance measures that are implemented really make it clear that the state was positioning itself in a way to preserve racial segregation. In this backdrop, the NAACP has to redouble its efforts. So the NAACP had won Brown versus Board of Education through the courts. Now the organization goes back into the courts to overturn massive resistance laws and to require federal judges, federal courts, to slowly begin to force the admittance of African American students into formerly all-white schools in Virginia. This legal action takes place over many, many different years, and it is a slow process that will eventually culminate into the admission of black students into formerly all-white schools. One of the massive resistance laws, I'll go ahead and say at the outset, one of the massive resistance laws mandated that the governor close any school in Virginia that was ordered desegregated by a federal court. That process comes to a head in the fall of 1958 when Governor J. Lindsay Almond closes schools in 3 different Virginia localities. This is a state-mandated closure, and it lasts for about 6 months because the NAACP immediately challenges the Virginia school closing law in the courts. When these schools are closed, local segregationists organize private schools for the white students, and African American students go unschooled in these locations, except for some remedial assistance that was provided by the NAACP. I point out here that they do so in part with funding that was provided by the state government from taxpayer dollars. So this is taxpayer money, known as tuition grants at the time, that was funneled into private schools that were created to preserve racial segregation. This unfolded for about 15 years before it was overturned by the federal courts. And as I note, many of these schools continue to exist. This is a topic that needs more research. Finally, the federal courts overturned the school closing law and other massive resistance measures, and they require that desegregation begin in Virginia. As you can see from this slide, it is national news. These are reporters from the New York Times and others. The Virginia battleground state has been vanquished, if you will, and now segregation is being slowly broken down. This is a very traumatic process for these children. I've interviewed many, many of them, and it was a very painful, difficult experience. Individuals like, and I apologize if you notice I'm battling with the clicker just a little bit, it's just a little lag here, but individuals like Lewis Cousins here at Norfolk High School were ostracized, had their books knocked out of their hands and spitballs in their hairs. Students wouldn't sit next to them on the buses or at lunch or in class. The teachers oftentimes wouldn't call on them. The stories are really disturbing. Slowly, this process will expand across Virginia from 3 localities to 10 localities to 20-some localities, and eventually every school locality in Virginia will have some school desegregation. And slowly, the number of African American students admitted will go from the Norfolk 17 initially, 17 to more, in each of those localities. This is the slow expansion of what we call token school desegregation. Prince Edward County takes a different tact. Prince Edward was part of the NAACP's litigation following Brown versus Board of Education, and after many different decisions, in the summer of 1959, federal courts require the county to begin the school desegregation process. At that point, the local Board of Supervisors, I emphasize local, make the decision to eliminate education from the county budget, closing all of the public schools in Prince Edward County. They will remain closed for 5 years. During this time period, the white segregationists create the Prince Edward Academy, today known as Fuqua School. African American students are left unschooled for these 5 years, except again for some remedial efforts undertaken by the Virginia Teachers Association and the NAACP, a Quaker organization from Philadelphia, and other groups as well. This particular document shows the segregationist viewpoint or perspective. They argued that Brown versus Board of Education was a federal overreach violating states' rights to segregated education. They expressed concern about racial mixing in the schools and potential relationships between black and white Virginians. They called it racial miscegenation, essentially racial intermarriage and the birth of mixed-race children, so on and so forth. Many different justifications offered for their resistance. White segregationists in Prince Edward County made a really strong effort to preserve white cohesion, When there were whites within the community that expressed support for reopening the schools, they were ostracized and sometimes targeted. When there were whites who came into the community, in this case, to play with African American students on the school grounds, they were monitored by the police. Some of you may know Ed Peoples, close friend of mine for many years, passed away not long ago. This is Ed Peoples' information that was collected by the police. The NAACP and the African American community fiercely opposed these school closings in many, many different ways. Through protests such as this on the courthouse grounds in Prince Edward County. This one drew Oliver Hill, the attorney, Reverend L. Francis Griffin, who was essentially the local African-American community leader. I don't want to oversimplify, but he was a leader in the community who worked very closely with the striking students. And then in the center, Roy Wilkins here was the head of the national NAACP. Again, a very prominent nationwide organization. For him to be in Prince Edward kind of reflects the severity of what was happening. And I'll go ahead and say that Prince Edward was the only county in the South to close its schools for an extended period of time rather than integrate them. Some of you know this individual. So this is in First Baptist Church in Reverend Griffin's church in 1962 when Martin Luther came through the South, came through Southern Virginia on a tour and stopped in to advocate for the reopening of the public schools. And then finally, before I turn to some documents and research, finally, this is an image at the federal courthouse in Richmond, Virginia, with plaintiffs or litigators from Prince Edward County and NAACP leaders and attorneys who were now fighting to reopen the public schools in the county through state and federal courts. On the right here, we've got Reverend Griffin. One of the most important NAACP attorneys of this time period is shown here. This is Samuel W. Tucker, Sam Tucker, an important figure who I'm writing about in my next book. And then if some of you might recognize this face, this is Sam Tucker's mentee, Henry Marsh, first African-American governor of the city of Richmond and then a longtime state senator. Marsh worked on this litigation as a young NAACP attorney at the time. Okay, I hope that overview wasn't too quick, but again, if you have questions, I'm happy to take them afterwards. I want to talk about now some of the new information that I've located in the last 5 years or so related to this story. We knew that there was an NAACP chapter in Farmville that was created in the late 1930s. We had not ever seen the documents related to its creation. I'm going to show you those first. The branch here, and again, this means it's a local entity of the organization. There was one in virtually every city or county around Virginia during this time period. It sends its application materials to the national NAACP in New York City. It required a minimum of 50 dues-paying members annually, had to be renewed each year. And once these applicants are sent in along with their money, then the national office would issue what was known as a charter, which was an official document allowing the organization to exist and to represent itself as a part of this NAACP organization. Here we have the creation of Prince Edward County's first NAACP branch. The date, January 1939. Reverend Griffin's father is one of the founding members. John Lancaster, who was a local farm agent, and his father were longtime civil rights activists in the community. If we have any individuals from Prince Edward County or Farmville, you'll also recognize names like Dr. M.P. Miller, who was very integral in the civil rights activities in the county for some time. I really enjoy this document because not only does it list the individuals and where they're from, but if you look carefully, it lists all of their occupations. And I think it gives us some really important insights into what made an individual financially independent enough to take a step like this, which I'll be perfectly honest, required some courage. Okay? There were strong feelings, and particularly after Brown versus Board of Education, there were strong feelings against the NAACP in Virginia. Sam, it's time for a new clicker. Some of you have recently seen or read the book Hidden Figures. You might be interested to know that Dorothy Vaughan was also one of the founding members of the Farmville NAACP. Now, this organization, from its creation in 1939, which incidentally is the same year that Moton High School opened, focused its efforts for the next decade or so on equalizing the schools or improving the educational opportunities available to African American students. They did things I already mentioned, went to many school board meetings, petitioned for better transportation, petitioned for more funding, petitioned for a longer school year, and many other things that would have enhanced the educational opportunities of their children. Came across this document not long ago, that talks about transportation, equalization of teacher salaries, and also a school meeting with the school board at which attorney or lawyer Oliver Hill, was present. We had read in Oliver Hill's autobiography, The Big Bang, that he had been to the county from time to time. Not many details there. Now we've got one showing exactly when he was in the county. Now, over the course of the next decade, the NAACP's branch in Farmville accomplished some things, but to be honest, it struggled with its membership. It regularly reported less than 50 members. It periodically got, kind of reminders or, not so nice notes from the national office saying you really need to redouble your efforts and so on and so forth. This document in 1950 indicates that the Farmville branch was down to 15 total memberships in late 1949. On this list of what we've got about 10 branches, it's the second lowest membership behind Pittsylvania County. I will note that one of the explanations, and this is something I've been thinking quite a bit about, but one of the explanations is that the NAACP at this time increased its annual membership dues from $1 to $2. That was not an insignificant amount of money at the time, for those of you who might remember, but certainly speaking about the challenges that the branch was facing, that's one to mention. Now, I indicate here that there are, at this time, 1950, things are starting to pick up, and it is a very, very important year when we think about the student strike and what's coming. As I mentioned, Barbara Johns really begins to plan the Manhattan Project in the fall of 1950 and organizes over the course of that winter for the strike in April of 1951. One of the things that I believe is relevant to this story is that about the same time as the NAACP was struggling with these memberships in the spring of 1950, Spotswood Robinson, the NAACP attorney, files a petition for a new African-American high school in the county next door to Prince Edward County. This is Cumberland County. And there's a whole series of newspaper articles that cover this event. I noted importantly that it is run in the Farmville Herald, which was a newspaper that both black and white residents of Prince Edward County were familiar with. Did Barbara Johns and some of her student strike co-leaders read these articles? Were they familiar with what was going on in Cumberland? It's hard to say, but it's certainly possible. One thing I would highlight is that the superintendent, and this is not an uncommon arrangement, but the superintendent for Prince Edward County was also the superintendent for Cumberland County. So the same individual that dealt with the student strikers in April of 1951 was dealing with the school equalization demands of the NAACP the year before, and undoubtedly familiar with its efforts all across the state of Virginia to make these same changes. Now, very interesting, in June of 1950, we have the creation of a new NAACP branch in Prince Edward County. This branch now is created for the county itself. Farmville, being a town, was considered a separate entity. It had its own branch, which we've already talked about. It was struggling. Now we have a branch that's going to encompass the entire county, and that's going to reflect the other units of the county itself. So this is in June of 1950. This new branch is organized. You can see the list of all the members here. The president, Edward Hamlin, was the uncle of Bob Hamlin, who's a resident of the county and a member of the advisory board for this project and a good friend. And you can see all the other individuals that are listed as well. One thing that stands out to me, if you look carefully, the Reverend L. Francis Griffin is not listed on this new NAACP branch membership list. I find that to be quite, well, I shouldn't say quite surprising, but a bit surprising. So the national office of the NAACP sends a letter to the state office in Richmond and a very, very similar letter to the local branch, the new branch, in October of 1950, and basically says that your charter's in the mail. You'll receive it in October. This is, of course, the end of the month. And then down at the bottom, we have suggested the presentation of the charter be made the occasion for a special public meeting with a prominent speaker to deliver the main address. I highlight October of 1950 because multiple accounts point to October of 1950 as the month that Barbara Johns began to organize the student strike. Several different accounts, including one of her own and one of John Watson, who was another strike leader, point to October as kind of a turning point for her. And there are some recollections of hers that tell different stories that lead us to this point in time as being transformative. I speculate by chance that the branch held an October event with a prominent speaker, and at that event, an NAACP Youth Council was created in Prince Edward County. Now, a youth council was essentially a branch for younger adults. Within the NAACP, you have the adult branches, the regular branches, and then beneath that, you have two alternatives. One are called college chapters, and they existed at most of the HBCUs at the time, Virginia State, Virginia Union, Norfolk State, and so forth. And then the third option was a youth council. These are branches essentially for teenagers, and they were meant to be subservient, if you will, underneath the hierarchy of the adult branch. They were meant to attend adult branch meetings and to learn about the NAACP. They were meant to allow these youths to basically become the future leaders of the NAACP. And they were meant to inform them about racial discrimination and prejudice around the state, as well as ways of combating that. In October of 1950, the first NAACP Youth Council was created in Prince Edward County. The document itself is filed the following spring. And this is the founding meeting, October of 1950. And if you look carefully through, I've highlighted just a few names. These are all strike leaders. Most notably, John Stokes and his sister Carrie, who were at the top of their class at R.R. Moten High School and were well known as very diligent, very exemplary student leaders, highly educated, well-read, so on and so forth. J. Samuel Williams, Reverend in Farmville today, also a strike leader at the time. These individuals now have joined the NAACP, albeit at a slightly lower level than the regular branch, which they were not allowed to join on their own. Now, the following spring, the the Youth Council submits some other documentation to the national office. This is the same application for charter, but what it is it's a list of additional members of the Youth Council. And the names that I've highlighted here are the names that will stand out to you most. Barbara Johns and her sister Joan Johns, today Joan Johns Cobb. So we know that between May 22nd, when this paperwork was filed, sent to New York City, and February, when the last meeting was held, that these individuals have joined the NAACP Youth Council. When I came across this document, I literally gasped. Okay. Never had heard anyone mention Barbara Johns or her sister or the other strike leaders being part of the NAACP. Never come across any mention of an NAACP Youth Council within the community being created, or the significance it has on the story of the student strike. Did they organize the strike on their own and implement it on their own? Yes, I believe so. Were they familiar with the NAACP and its efforts to equalize African American and white schools in Virginia? Absolutely. Were they familiar with its legal apparatus and the initiative that it had undertaken over the previous 10 years to do that? Most likely. In some ways, this begins to change the way that we think about the development of the student strike. The questions that we can't answer, at least not yet, is this. When did Barbara Johns join the organization and why? Did she join it after April 23rd? If so, then she was essentially joining after the strike and perhaps even after they'd been in contact with the NAACP attorneys. Or did she join it between February and April, perhaps in March after the student bus crash that killed one of her closest friends, and as they became essentially prepared to launch the student strike itself? This is one of the questions that we'll work to answer over the course of the next few years. I should also note that on this list of additional members, that there are other student strike leaders that are part of it, including John Watson and some others. And finally, I'll just end with a couple of other documents in this part, and then I've got one other story to tell, and that is this. After the student strike in April, the Farmville NAACP is reorganized. So not the county branch, as I was just talking about, but the city branch that had been struggling for over a decade is reorganized. And now L. Francis Griffin, the Reverend, takes over as president. Again, we knew that the city branch had been recreated, but not when, not why, and not how. Now we have those records showing L. Francis Griffin stepping up to lead the organization. And this is from the fall annual convention. You've got him here with the reorganized, the fighting preacher. And down on the right, you've got a youth night program that's led by Carrie Stokes, one of the strike leaders. They're now being kind of publicized by the state NAACP for what had unfolded in this community. The last story I want to tell is from the perspective of the white segregationists. Came across some other information that I had never read before about Prince Edward County when digging through the University of Virginia archives. Harry Byrd we've already introduced. In the fall of 1957, there was a governor's race in Virginia, and he says the #1 issue is integration or segregation within the public schools. I came across a series of interesting correspondence between Byrd and several other segregationist leaders around Virginia. Here's with James Jackson Kilpatrick, the editor of the Richmond News Leader. It was a very great pleasure to see you in Prince Edward. Here with the local NAACP attorney for the Board of Supervisors. It was a great pleasure to be with you in Prince Edward, so on and so forth. There's a whole series of other documents between Byrd and other leaders around Virginia that were part of this meeting. And so we know that there was a secret meeting. This is not publicized in the press. It's not in the newspapers. It's not in any of the scholarship that I've come across thus far. November of 1957, we've got Harry Byrd, Watkins Abbott, who represented in the United States House of Representatives, J. Lindsay Allman, who had just been elected governor of Virginia, the same one that was on the cover at Time, J. Seeger Gravitt, we just talked about, James Jackson Kilpatrick, the newspaper editor. Who else was there? Undoubtedly, there were other local segregationists there. This is something that I'm trying to track down now. It was a Saturday evening in late November, soon after the election. They met at Baldwin's Cabin. There's a Baldwin's department store in downtown Farmville. I've made a few inquiries, but we haven't determined who Baldwin was just yet. And they were there to hunt turkeys, but they were also there to discuss the school integration process in Virginia and to, I think, really make it clear to the newly elected governor that the stance that they wanted him to adopt was to continue massive resistance at all costs. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Brian. My colleague and I here have microphones. If there are any questions, we'd be happy to.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much. Very, very great presentation. I have two questions. One simple. Who was Robert Moton, and was he an African American or a white person?
Fantastic. Yeah, Robert R. Moton was an African American leader who had ties to Prince Edward County and then went on to succeed Booker T. Washington as the president of Tuskegee Institute down in Alabama and became a nationally known figure in civil rights activities.
All right, and the second question. Given the current administration and their pressure on the National Park Service on the way that history is presented, do you think you're going to be able to present this the way you would want to?
That's a fantastic question, and as a historian, I don't often dive into the politics of the present day, but what I will say is this is an integral part of Virginia history. There's no way you understand Virginia history without talking about race, prejudice, discrimination, segregation, enslavement, so on and so forth. If it's divisive, then so be it. There's no way to there's no way to cover this history, to understand this history without understanding race relations in Virginia. And so I will continue to do everything that I can to tell that history as accurately as possible.
Thank you very much. I think that Moton Museum is a real treasure in Virginia, and it seems to be underappreciated or underused, but I found it to be fantastic, and I recommend it highly. But I was curious about Hampton-Sydney and Longwood. They bracketed the Moton School for years, two great educational institutions. At the time, I think Longwood may have even been a teacher's college. So what was their role, bad or good, in what happened at Moton?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So first thing I'll say is the Moton Museum is coming up on its 25th anniversary this year, which is fantastic. They, as I mentioned earlier, are doing amazing work, very, very important work. It was a struggle for them to obtain the building from the county and to create the museum, so it's been a hard-fought battle to preserve this history and make sure that it's told widely. So I strongly commend everybody that was part of the creation of the museum and that continues to maintain it in the present day. You asked about Hampton-Sydney and Longwood. Both of those institutions manifested some hesitancy to support the cause of civil rights. I'll start off by putting it a little mildly. Longwood was a teacher's college, and it did have faculty that spoke out in favor of the public schools. That put the president of the institution in a bit of a predicament, and he periodically tried to tamp down that sort of an expression. But a history professor by the name of Gordon Moss at Longwood College at the time, University Today, was one of the more moderate white leaders. Moss was a segregationist, but he supported public schools, and he was one of the few that said that explicitly, and he faced repercussions for that. The president of Longwood, I don't know if I would use the word protected him, but there were calls for Moss to lose his job and to leave the county and so on and so forth. And so I do think that Longwood took some steps to at least express or at least protect his freedom of expression. Hampton, Sydney, I don't know as much about. It's located a few more miles away from Farmville. It's a private institution. What I can tell you is there wasn't any sort of outwardly public support for school desegregation coming out of either institution.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I have two comments and one question on Longwood. I recently read an article that they decimated a black community to build the ball field, I believe, in the 1950s. And so if that says something about the position of Longwood at that time. Secondly, I'm not from this part of Virginia, from Northern Virginia, but it never fails that when I drive from Richmond through Amelia County over into Prince Edward County to perhaps to shop at Farmville, that you see Confederate flags. And it's just a reminder of how these attitudes haven't died. I mean, they're still there, and we see its presence and manifestation in so many ways, but that, since we're talking about this area. The question, I think you referenced very quickly changes to the Virginia Constitution that were elements of massive resistance, but you didn't touch on any of those. Mm-hmm. And since we have constitutional amendments on the ballot coming up in November, it'd be nice to know what some of the things are that may still be embedded in our Constitution that arose out of this massive resistance effort.
Thank you so much. First of all, I will say that, and I think it is important to recognize that not many years ago, Longwood University created a partnership with the Moton Museum. And the two of them are now integrally tied to the mission of Moton and this story and its preservation and its telling and so forth. Longwood University's archives now have a collection of oral history interviews related to this story and so on and so forth. So I think Longwood's role historically was not ideal, but Longwood has taken some really, really important steps in recent decades to partner with the museum in its mission, and I do think that that's important to recognize. You mentioned the flag. One of the other projects that I'm working on right now is the role of the Confederate flag in the massive resistance era. The flag, of course, dates back to the 1860s of the war and so forth, but it had a bit of a revival in the 1940s and particularly in the 1950s as a symbol against not the North or the Union, but as a symbol against school integration, as a symbol against Brown versus Board education. And so we see a revival and expansion of the use of the flag and so on and so forth during that time period. And I think that you could make the argument that you see some of that in more recent years as well. And finally, to the Constitution. The first thing I'll say is that Virginia has adopted a subsequent Constitution in 1971 that abandoned many of the prejudicial and discriminatory measures that had been in the previous Constitution, which dated back to 1902. So we have seen a subsequent revision. But to answer your specific question, the alteration to the Constitution in 1956 was to allow the state to spend public taxpayer money on private schools, private institutions. So to allow the state to provide the tuition grants that I was talking about that went to so many of those segregationist academies. That was the specific constitutional alteration that took place during the massive resistance era. Okay.
How long was tuition grants in effect?
Until 1969.
No,
No, in Prince Edward, it lasts a certain period of time before the federal courts order that they can't use tuition grants to maintain the private academy during the period of litigation. I don't, I'm not 100%. Yeah, there is the midnight raid on the Treasury you've probably heard of, yeah. So I don't know that the money was paid back. They were initially used during the first year or so of the creation of the academy, and I'm pretty certain that that money was not paid back, but I am speculating. That tuition grant program is ended by the federal courts.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Betty Crutcher, and I'm from Tuskegee, Alabama, and so I do know Robert Moton. In fact, I think Patterson came after him as president of Tuskegee Institute, where I attended college. But more importantly, being in Richmond now, since being here with my husband, who was a former president of the University of Richmond, we have had the pleasure of going to Longwood University to witness Reverend Griffin's son receiving an honorary degree. We were friends with him, but he was one of the students who had to leave the state when the schools were closed to go to Massachusetts, and he ended up with a degree from Harvard.
Yeah, I believe you're referring to Skip, and we've got some interesting photographs of Skip and many of his student colleagues participating in protests in Farmville in the 1960s against the school closures, but against the fact that there was still widespread segregation throughout the town of Farmville itself. And he was one of the leaders of that protest movement.
All right. This is such a great discussion. I know I think only have time for one more, but if Brian is so generous, he might be able to stick around after.
I'm happy
and
to take
chat
as many
afterwards,
questions
too.
as you all have.
Okay. So we'll have one more here, and then afterwards. Yeah.
I lived in Farmville for 10 years during the 80s and witnessed a lot of things changing slowly. I'd like for you, these are comments that I'd like for you to comment on because the high school has finally been torn down. It's between 1st and 2nd Street. And I moved after it was torn down, but you would drive by it for years and it was boarded up. Nothing was allowed to be happening on that big field. It is torn down now, and I think the property belongs to Longwood University, and the decision was basically to do nothing with the property but use it as sports fields. So I guess you would say that was a positive thing eventually that Longwood University did. Also, I wanted to say to the lady that talked about the houses torn down, I witnessed those. Even in the 80s, they were being torn down on that back street behind the baseball field, one at a time as eminent domain took them. So she's, of course, correct. I think that eventually Hampton-Sydney made a personality, such as the Buntings, made a great contribution because they were among the first parents that said our children will go to the public Prince Edward County High School. Cy Bunting was president of Hampton-Sydney at the time, and following him, a great number of faculty sent their children to the public schools, and they were the first really big step out to take a position on that. Another thing, many people may know about the old Longwood College Demonstration School. I'm sad to say that I had children that went there, but they went there because their parents were faculty members, and that was an elite opportunity, you might say. But you did that so that you didn't support the academy, but the academy was thriving then. But you didn't have to take a stand. You could just send your children to the Longwood College Demonstration School rather than sending them to the public school. So you were sort of doing nothing to make things better.
Thank you.
So I just want to make those comments. I thought you might want to comment on the struggle of the high school building being there so long and why that happened.
Yeah, honestly, I don't know much about the high school building. I assume you're talking about Farmville High.
Yes.
I don't know much about it other than, when it was constructed and when it initially burned down in the 30s and was rebuilt, but I don't know much of the history afterward. I will say that, the Prince Edward Academy still exists, and the county schools are more integrated than they were at the time, but there is still a racial disparity that's evident in enrollment within Prince Edward County. So, we have certainly seen a lot of change in the area and so forth, but there's, I think the the trauma of these years and the battle that was waged in this particular locality has created some divisions that continue.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, again, for coming out. Thank you, Brian. Thank you.